Director of Policy and Partnerships for Clean Energy Canada. And Dan is an accomplished analyst and advocate with significant knowledge and experience in the field of energy and environmental policy. He has authored numerous studies and articles on clean energy and climate change policy. Since 2001, Dan has lobbied for policy change, testified before regulatory and legislative bodies, and commented on energy issues for a wide range of media outlets. He holds degrees in environmental science and environmental management, but I think also of note, Dan is a friend, someone who I call on regularly for level-headed advice to understand the changing dynamics across Canada and the interplay between all technologies. And he's been a real driver behind the idea that collaboration is needed between energy sources to bring us to this future. So Dan, thank you for moderating, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you, John. Before I make my opening remarks, I'll just introduce the other panelists that we have up here on the stage with us. At the far end is Dr. John Barrett. He's the president and CEO of the Canadian Nuclear Association. His professional career includes foreign affairs, national defense, and the Privy Council office, international organizations such as NATO, and policy think tanks such as the Canadian Centre for Arms Control and Disarmament. Before joining the Nuclear Association, Dr. Barrett was Canada's ambassador to the International Atomic Energy Agency, where he chaired the Board of Governors, and was Canada's ambassador and permanent representative to the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization and to the UN in Vienna. He has served as ambassador to Austria and to the Slovak Republic, and he has a BA Honours and MA from the University of Toronto and a PhD from the London School of Economics. Next to him is Mr. Jacob Irving, who served as the president of the Canadian Hydropower Association since 2009. He has over a decade of experience as an energy professional and association manager, and is a poli-sci graduate from the University of Ottawa. He started his career in government with the Library of Parliament in Ottawa, and then went to Cape Town, South Africa, where he worked as a project manager for the Western Cape Provincial Parliament. Prior to leading the Hydro Association, Jacob was the executive director of the Oil Sands Developers Group, now known as the Community Oil Sands Alliance in Fort McMurray. Mr. Robert Hornung has been president of the Canadian Wind Energy Association since August 2003, where he represents the interests of CanWIA's members, who are Canada's wind energy leaders. He's also a board member of the Global Wind Energy Council and was named a Fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society in 2009. Prior to joining CanWIA, he worked on climate change issues with the Pembina Institute, Environment Canada, the OECD, and the Friends of Earth Canada. So this morning, we're going to be talking about the energy transformation that's happening around the world, but more specifically, how it's evolving and unfolding here in Canada. As John mentioned in his opening remarks this morning, over the past year, we've seen a lot of change. A lot of momentum is being built, and for those of us that are looking at those trends, looking at some of the forecasts for the future, it seems that that's only going to continue. So a quick recap of some of those trends that are shaping how we produce and consume energy. One is that in 2014, for the first time, we saw emissions stall while the economy grew. And the International Energy Agency attributes that to two things: energy efficiency and renewable energy. And that's the first time that we've seen that decoupling happen. In the past, we've seen emissions stall, but only when we've been suffering from a global economic depression. So that's significant. When it comes to the geopolitics of energy, we also saw a major breakthrough in the collaboration between the United States and China, two of the world's biggest polluters and biggest producers and consumers of energy. We've seen how that collaboration on clean energy and on climate policy has played forward into the run-up to the global climate negotiations currently underway in Paris. Earlier this year, we saw Ontario announce their intent to develop a cap-and-trade system and to join it with Quebec and California. We had President Obama deliver the final rules of the Clean Power Plan, which has some good news for Canadian electricity exports, because those exports can be used to comply with those regulations. In Alberta, not only did we see a new government elected for the first time in many decades, but a government that came in with a mandate to actually turn around Alberta's approach to climate change. So we've seen them this fall. They've introduced a plan that will see a carbon tax in Alberta, a phase out of coal-fired power by 2030, and a target of 30% renewable energy generation by 2030. We also have a new federal government also elected with a mandate to lead on climate change and on clean energy technology. Saskatchewan announced a goal of 50% renewable capacity by 2030. Manitoba announced that they're also going to pursue a cap and trade system. And as we speak, we've got nations from around the world forging a new climate agreement in Paris. So all of this presents tremendous opportunity for low carbon, non-emitting sources of energy around the world, but also here in Canada. So this morning, we're going to have a little bit of conversation about what does that mean? What does that mean for the technologies that are represented here on the stage? What does it mean for our electricity system? And ultimately, what does it mean for Canadians? So to start, I'd like to just chat about your observations about what has changed. All of you in your roles are out there engaging with governments, engaging with your members and receiving feedback and input from them, also hearing from communities and a wide range of stakeholders. So perhaps I'll start with you, John Barrett, and we'll just work our way up back to me. What's changed and what does it mean?
Well, from the perspective of our industry, one of the things that you notice right away is, of course, the COP21 discussions, which is where you put the spotlight on, I think, all energy technologies that can contribute to a low carbon future. And that includes the nuclear energy. I think people in this audience are aware that it is emissions free in its power generation. And so when you go to international meetings, and the ones in which I've participated, with a wide range of stakeholders, and on the discussion of climate change and energy security, one of the topics that comes to light right away is that if we really want to make an impact right away on reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, it's to stop coal. And at the same time, we see that China and India are building coal plants. So we get very quickly into that, what is the most practical at hand sources that we have of power generation to get moving now. In due course, other types of energy, the renewable energies, will start to come on more and more and take up that role. But my preoccupation, and I think with our members, is that how do you manage this in the interim? How do you make that smooth transition? How do you do a cap and trade in Ontario that doesn't inadvertently start pushing out industries from Ontario? We've seen enough of them, of the manufacturing industries, go over the last few years for various reasons, but including high electricity costs. So I'll just stop there. I'll let the others have a chance. But this growing recognition that we can't be cherry-picking technologies and saying this one over that, but as this panel represents, we all have a role to play.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Dan. I think that one of the big things that has changed, and we see it at all different political levels throughout Canada, North America, the world, is the greater acceptance of climate change as the threat that it is. I think Canada has a lot to be proud of from a very grassroots perspective, in the sense that, our action on climate change has really started at the lower political levels and has percolated its way to the top. And we're seeing provinces who have led on climate change, who now have a federal government with whom they can connect and talk about it at a national level. And in the United States, you're even seeing a greater acceptance of the climate change arguments. And I think that the Clean Power Plan coming into force is going to be another marker, another milestone in the U.S. becoming more progressive on this issue. And then when you percolate up to the international level, the Paris COP level, I think I was listening to President Obama's speech about a week or so ago, and I thought he made a very good point when he was talking about how this time around you've got 180 countries that are coming talking about plans for climate change, as opposed to a whole mess of countries coming arguing about whether or not it's a problem in the first place, and those sorts of things. I think a lot of those arguments are in the rearview mirror. I think they're behind us, and I think a lot of the election results, provincially and federally, have underscored that. And so we're in a good place now, I think, to take off from there. The challenge for all of us now will be to actually realize the promise and to demonstrate that we can actually meet the challenge and meet the needs of all of these different electors and these different governments who now actually want to get really serious on it and change it. It's going to be a little bit less about arguing about whether or not climate change is real, thank goodness. It's going to be a little bit more in terms of figuring out and actually achieving results and being able to report back to everybody that not only can we fix it, but we have a plan for it and we're actually seeing results. So it's going to be hard work for all of us, but I think it's going to be exciting work. It's going to be a bit, I dare say, it's going to be fun, I think, across this country, across our different industries. And I think that Canadians have a lot to be hopeful for, and I think we can do it.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who worked for a decade as an advocate on climate change before coming to Canada, the change that we've seen in the last 12 months, 18 months is quite phenomenal, because we've actually moved from talking about climate change to actually doing something about it. And that's been nowhere more evident in Canada than within the electricity sector. And I think a lot of that is driven by cost. And what we've seen happening with cost of different technologies, I know wind, we've seen 61% decline in cost over the last 6 years. The cost decline has been even greater in solar. And that's led to a situation where something really has fundamentally changed, where a province like Saskatchewan can come forward and say, we want to move to make 50% of our generating capacity renewable, because we actually realize it makes economic sense to do that. Saskatchewan is actually the first example of a utility in Canada that has actually made a very strong renewables commitment without being pressured to do so by government. It's a utility that made that decision on its own. And it did that because it looked at where the world is headed, it looked at the costs, and made that decision. The other thing is, I think we're seeing a much higher level of public engagement, which is going to continue to drive, I think, political and utility decisions going forward. People saw the different marches that happened on the eve of Paris. We've been working with CanSIA in Alberta doing a digital advertising campaign, and in the course of a month had 35,000 people click through to a website to learn more about wind and solar energy. There's a lot of interest, a lot of potential out there right now, and I think that really does provide a solid platform for growth going forward.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so I spoke at length on this issue this morning, so I'll be brief. And my friends and colleagues here have covered the landscape, but I will pick up on just maybe two threads here. One is this profound impact that climate policy is having that these folks have all spoken to, is impacting multiple sectors and making each of them look at how they're going to manage their energy differently. And from a solar industry's perspective, this has significant implications and creates significant opportunity, right? Because solar PV, solar thermal, heating and cooling of buildings is going to be able to apply down to quite a granular level, whether it's people's homes or commercial businesses, et cetera, industries. So it's this overall context is creating demand and opportunity through multiple sectors, and solar is uniquely able to participate in that, in addition to collaborating and presenting the utility scale type solutions. And the last thing I'll say is just to pick up on Robert's point about his experience with the different, the changing public demand and opinion around climate change. Clearly we're talking about consumers here who are demanding all of the things that Lisa spoke about, and that clearly involves solar catering to those consumer demands and needs.
Right. So I'd actually now like to just dive right into some of the nitty-gritty. We've talked about the opportunity. I think everybody is aware of the opportunity, is excited by it. Jake, to your point, I think it is, we're entering an era where this could actually be a lot of fun, but it's going to come with some challenges as well. Now, you're all competitors, but by the same token, having spoken with all of you, you all recognize as well that, having that diversity of sources of electricity is a positive attribute for the electricity system. But as Canadians are expecting to have affordable power, reliable power, but also now clean power. That's a pretty challenging thing to deliver. And so I'd like to hear from each of you, and perhaps, John, I'll start with you because solar is perhaps the most disruptive in this regard. How can you all fit together? How do we actually integrate these different sources of power into the grid in a way that is, cost-effective, reliable, while at the same time obviously delivering that clean power that people say they want without necessarily understanding the complexity of actually getting it?
Mm-hmm. Well, so first of all, we're all emissions-free technologies up here. And each technology has different attributes that the others don't have. And it's by bringing together these technologies to create, for lack of a better term, an orchestra that creates the sort of vibes that we need for our electricity system is what the solution is. So solar, is not the silver bullet. But that being said, solar's unique attributes have to do with its incredible scalability, right? On the utility scale side and on the distribution connected side. So our proposition to people and businesses and communities is different than the other technologies up here on stage, and it is going to be playing that role within this new energy framework that this climate policy movement is creating. I'll just on the cost issue, because I know that was a specific question. Our solar is becoming increasingly competitive. As Robert noted, it's coming down, I guess, the quickest of all technologies, and soon will be competitive by any measure. And so I think that's a hurdle we're going to be overcoming in the next few number of years.
Robert, interested in hearing on this from you as well, recognizing that wind has been scaling up for a longer period than solar, has some of the same attributes, some different attributes and different challenges as well. So from a wind perspective, how do you fit?
Well, I think the question that people will be most interested in, you highlighted three things: clean, affordable, reliable. I think we've already demonstrated we're cost competitive. We're clean. So it really comes down to this question of reliability and how that's managed going forward. And I would start off, I guess, by saying that, first off, we've already done a tremendous job in terms of demonstrating successful integration of variable generation. We have 15 jurisdictions, either countries or U.S. states, that are already getting more than 15% of their electricity today from wind. And all of those jurisdictions want to grow that going forward. And what we've seen consistently is system operators, as they've started integrating variable generation technologies, they're very cautious, and they have to be. It's a pretty big job to ensure that supply meets demand, and you can't screw that up. But I think we've seen very consistently that as system operators gain experience, they recognize that sort of some of the limitations they foresaw fall away. And what we now actually have is system operators having a huge toolbox, actually, that they can work with to help integrate different sources of variable generation. Sometimes it's by partnering with other generation sources, so wind and hydro, for example. Nuclear has made some real efforts to be more flexible, although I think it's fair to say that different technologies have different attributes in that regard and their ability to help in integration. You also see a lot of experimentation going on the demand side. It's where you can manage variable supply by varying demand. And you see a lot of initiatives, and that was talked about by the previous speaker as well. Forecasting, which helps to minimize uncertainty going forward. Expansion of balancing areas to give you more flexibility and tools to manage these things. And ultimately storage in the longer term as well has a role. So I think our challenge right now is not having a shortage of tools. We have a lot of tools that can help facilitate integration. And I think we've got two things that we have to be watchful of. One, we have to be careful not to make decisions now that limit our ability to integrate variable generation going forward. If we do that, electricity is always, we're talking about long-term, long-lived investments. You don't want to put something in now and say 10 years later, oh, geez, I really regret I did that because now I have to bring a bunch more of this, and this is actually making it harder. And I think the other thing that we need to think about in terms of that regard is to look at those opportunities that actually, as I said, sort of open the door to greater integration as opposed to closing the door to greater integration going forward.
Jacob, I mean, hydro in the Canadian context has played a foundational role in our electricity system, and we've definitely seen some innovation from a number of hydro utilities in terms of collaborating with other jurisdictions to integrate some of those variable renewables. What do you see the role of hydro being going forward in that role, both providing a lot of baseload power on the one hand, but also that ability to help integrate wind, solar that are variable?
Well, I think, we talked about it a little bit at last year's conference, and I have to say it's always nice to be close to friends this close to Christmas too, actually, everybody on stage. Thanks for the invitation again. But, last year when we talked about it, we talked again a little bit about Canada's huge hydropower storage capacity. This is something that makes Canada unique on the world stage. And, it's been around for 130 years. Sometimes hydro tends to hide in plain sight almost. But our storage capacity really allows Canada to be a welcoming place for disruptive technologies, for new renewables. And why? Because hydropower, for its 130-year history, is the most dispatchable form of electricity generation. You can turn us on and off faster than any other source. And with storage in the background, we have an incredibly strategic asset base across Canada for bringing more clean and renewable electricity. Of course, hydropower is clean and renewable in its own right, but then when you start adding the other clean and renewable technologies on top, I keep saying that moving to a clean, renewable electricity future for Canada should not be a trip to the dentist's office. It's more like a trip to the candy store. We have nothing but choice, and the fact that our country made such strong hydro decisions over the course of its history has really positioned us in an enviable place to be able to look at all of these different technologies and choose. And in fact, the competition amongst us, I think, is good in that respect. It helps us keep an eye on cost and make sure that we deliver maximum value. I think the other thing I might mention based on cost has to do with a little something that a terrific energy speaker that I heard from in Quebec this past spring. There's an energy speaker on energy and environment. I think his name was Dan Woynillowicz. That's the way I pronounce the name anyway.
We'll stick with Smith.
Yeah, right. It's sort of like a Rorschach test. You get to put your own interpretation on the line.
Will you tell us at the end how to pronounce that? Would you?
That should be an outcome of this panel, I think. But Dan, you were talking about, and I thought it was really good, was that we need to move to thinking like a travel agent, where travel agents don't sell trips to people based on the plane ride. You don't sell a trip to Italy based on what the plane trip is going to be like. You talk about what Italy is going to be like. And I think we're there at this point, is that, I think of COP discussions, I think of discussions of carbon tax versus cap and trade, I think of clean power plan, these very important things. These are very much, though, about the plane ride. These are very much about the trip, and we lose a lot of people in that discussion. Where we can speak to people now more and more is about the destination. And the destination is about a cleaner, more renewable power system. And we need to, and people, I think, fundamentally know that if we get there, that it's a good place to be. I think that they feel good about the idea of maybe one day being able to drive an electric vehicle instead of a fossil fuel burning vehicle. I think that they know that. I think one of the things that we can move into more now is to explain to everybody that it's possible. And that, again, it's not a trip to the dentist, it's a trip to the candy store. And when you consider that hydro in Canada, I mean, we are unique compared to the rest of the world. Lots of people talk about hours of storage. They talk about days, months of storage capacity and electricity. In Canada, we talk about years of electricity storage capacity based on our hydro system. So, it shouldn't be a difficult thing to get people to this place. And one last thing I'll say on cost is I think we need to really be able to talk more and more about companies that choose clean, renewable electricity. That's really important because I'm convinced that it's going to be a competitive advantage in the future. Progressive companies, the types of companies whose jobs you want to offer, you talk about Google, Apple, Tesla, all the different exciting new companies that offer really exciting new jobs to people. They're very worried about their carbon footprint, and they have potentially huge carbon footprints. And so they are kind of discreetly choosing to set up shop in places that offer clean, renewable electricity more and more. I think that needs to be less discreet, and I think people need to know that there's a huge potential benefit in terms of quality jobs that come out of making the change to renewable electricity. So that if there are any costs in terms of per kilowatt, if they go up somewhat as a result of that, if that's offset by the economic development that comes from this positive change, then I think we can keep people focused on the destination. And that's important for all of us. There is one example I'll just end on for hydro, and it comes from the United States, just as an example. It's in Washington State. And in Washington State in the U.S., they're very different. They are over 70% hydro. They're only 7% fossil in that state, so they're a very different state. They attracted a major investment from BMW Corporation for their advanced carbon fiber manufacturing plant. It was built in Moses Lake. And BMW explicitly told the world that they chose that location because of hydro generation and the other clean renewables there as well. Clean and renewable power is the way they do things in Washington State. And this advanced carbon fiber plant that is going to make electric vehicles for BMW was built there specifically because of that. And I think we need more stories like that fleshed out, because in that sort of world, you can balance any kind of cost concerns for electricity versus economic development that can come along with it.
Right. So John, we've talked about, on the one hand, the variables, wind and solar, the dispatchability of hydro. Nuclear has historically played a significant role, and as we just heard last week in Ontario, is going to continue to play a role. And so what are some of the challenges, but then also how can we overcome those challenges in terms of how nuclear fits into that system?
Well, I think one of the challenges is one of lifting the veil of sometimes misinformation or just lack of understanding of the role that nuclear plays in a jurisdiction like Ontario. Ontario is unique in that 60% of its electricity at any time, including now, is generated by nuclear sources, and most people don't realize that. Our emissions-free electricity generation in the province is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's anywhere from 93 to 94%. So as a province, we have this tremendously high record that is enviable. At the same time, we do have some then issues with costs of electricity, as I mentioned earlier, for some of the industrial consumers and the like. So we have to look very carefully at costs. And then again, when we say that nuclear is produced and is committed to a production at 6.8 cents a kilowatt hour, people just skate right by that, pocket it, if you will, and then talk about other things. And yet it is a huge advantage. So I think that one of the challenges that we have is to ensure that people see, as ratepayers, as consumers, that there is this long-term reliability. One of our members who does produce a lot of manufacturing and sort of heavy manufacturing in southwest Ontario, when he was speaking to some representatives of the Ontario government, he just said, reliability is the single most important thing to people like him who are involved in industrial processes that go on for day after day, and they cannot have an interruption in electricity. A brownout, yes, that's even more extreme, but these interruptions could be very dramatic to their bottom line. So again, the reliability sounds like just a quick word and we pass by it. Affordability, quick word, we pass by it. But I really want to encourage people to think more about what that means. So there's one challenge. On the plus side, Ontario has this remarkable model that I'm convinced we can take internationally, because there are countries out there that are looking at nuclear power. We're also encourage them, I think, as world citizens, to look at non-fossil fuel power generation, and they need that. They need that power generation. So what's the mix? And if we can show from Ontario experience how we integrate the nuclear base load with the flexibility, increasing flexibility, with a real close integration with renewable, we then have that non-fossil fuel model that we can take to with our technologies, with our expertise, with our consulting, and maybe make an impact internationally. So there's an area that I look forward to, because if we get that right, we have a great international product.
Right. So, Jacob, to your point, I often like talking about how when it comes to public engagement, you need to sell them on the beach, not on the cramped legroom on the plane and the lineups at the airport to get to the beach. But that said, if you look at headlines in the newspaper, oftentimes what the focus has been of late when it comes to electricity has been the journey, the evolution of the grid, and some of the challenges that has created, including on consumer pocketbooks. So there needs to be a balance between, on the one hand, kind of educating and engaging consumers in terms of the evolution of the electricity system, while also not getting mired in what's a very complex topic. And you only have at best 30 seconds or 140 characters worth of attention span for this topic. So I'd like to hear from each of you, and perhaps John, we'll start with you and work our way back, just in terms of how you communicate to people about, on the one hand, this complex topic, but simplifying it to a way that doesn't oversimplify it, but I think speaks to the evolution of the system, the inevitability of that evolution, and the necessity of it, and really what's the value proposition to them.
Let's simply start off with, because we have to do this very quickly, so I'll try. Then we start with that all energy systems have risks. And you know that in the solar industries, there are different risks of the industry. There are different waste products. There are different aspects to it that maybe you don't talk about so much in the public, but is there. So we come forward with that. Nuclear has risks. Other forms do as well. Others have waste products that are not accounted for. In the nuclear business, we account for. So how do you manage these risks? And from there, you go into the proposition, because you're managing any risk with your energy and your productive system. And at the same time, you're able to talk about then the benefits to humanity. And with nuclear, it goes not just with electricity generation, but it's the cobalt-60 in the hospitals, it's the medical isotopes, it's the advanced manufacturing, the quality testing of the rotor blades and jet engines, the non-destructive assessments. The list goes on these on desalination and nutrition and soil. All these are using nuclear technology one way or the other. And that's when I then see if I can get some sort of take-up with the audience.
Right.
I think from a hydro perspective, we have to do a better job of explaining storage, I think, to the greater Canadian public. Just in the sense, there's a lot of excitement around storage, and there's a lot of talk about new technologies in terms of what I would sometimes call downstream storage. So that would be batteries, balloons in Lake Ontario, different interesting things that are going to be part of the mix, and that should be part of the mix in terms of making sure that we have reliability. But people have to remember that in Canada, we are fundamentally different from most other countries in the world, in that we have massive hydropower storage. And I mean, we have what I call conventional storage projects, and then there's also pump storage capability as well within Canada. And the reason why it's important for us to talk about this more, or to make this more clear, is because when you think about it, many countries around the world, especially OECD countries, developed countries, many of them have built out their hydropower capacity. And so they are into questions more so of downstream storage. Why? Because they don't have upstream storage to build. In Canada, we have massive upstream storage capacity still left available to us. And that is an extreme strategic benefit to us. And unfortunately, people don't understand that quite so well, or they don't appreciate it. They either don't really have a good sense of the existing storage we have, or the huge undeveloped potential that we still have underfoot. if there's any key message that I try to leave any audience with, it's that Canada is the third largest hydropower developer in the world. And that's significant because number one is China with 1.6 billion people. Number two is Brazil with 230 million people. Number three is Canada with 35 million people. We clearly box above our weight class when it comes to hydropower. And what's more remarkable than all of that is, as big as we are, third largest generator in the world, we could still more than double our existing potential. And inside that potential is a lot of storage capacity. And that's extremely important to a world where new renewables are coming on. And in that sense, we have the scale and ability not just to transform our system in Canada, in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan who are coming off coal and looking to renewables. We can help the United States, who we all know is 10 times our size. We have the ability to back up their systems and to bring on their clean renewables as well. So we have a lot to offer ourselves in Canada. We have a lot to offer the Americans as well, who, last we all check, have a much bigger problem than we do in terms of electricity generation and greenhouse gas emissions. So we're big nationally, we're big continentally, and we have the opportunity to be even bigger globally. So it's exciting times for all of us.
So, and Robert, that balance between the pros and the cons and the complexity of what wind means for the electricity system, how do you tackle that concisely?
You had to throw in that last word.
That's the challenge.
And I'm actually going to take it a different way, because I think the challenge is actually not to sort of do myth busting for each individual technology, and sort of, because we all have misunderstandings or misconceptions about the technologies, and we all have strengths and weaknesses. And so there's, yes, a greater energy literacy effort and greater understanding that needs to occur. But the beach that you're talking about is not a solar beach, it's not a wind beach, it's not a hydro beach. It's a beach that actually involves all of these technologies. And I think the key message is to sell, and Jacob started speaking to this, why Canada in particular is well positioned to create that beach. And it's because we have, yes, significant undeveloped hydro resources, significant solar, significant wind resources. We're resource rich. We have that ability to do integration. We have we sit beside one of the largest markets in the world and can provide export opportunities into that market to help clean their system, provide reliable electricity and everything else. And we also need to speak, and I think in terms of the education, empowerment, and everything else, again, the plenary speaker or the keynote speaker that spoke earlier talked about that change that's happening in the electricity system. And I think that's part of the vision, in a sense, that change, what are we moving towards and why? And it's partially, yes, it's cleaner, it will be reliable and everything else, but it's also empowering. It's also a future which envisions individuals playing a much larger role in energy management, energy production, energy demand management going forward. And that in itself will be both empowering but educational, and I hope will create a virtuous circle in the end, whereby as people learn more, they'll want to learn more, they'll get engaged more, and we'll build momentum going forward.
Right. So John, I want to take it one step further with you based on some of your remarks this morning where you're speaking about the opportunity associated with electrification. And so for those that are in the business of producing power, increased electricity and the demand that comes with that, that's obviously the beach, and that's going to look good on the balance sheet. So want to get your sense, and then anybody else can chime in as well, in terms of this idea of fuel switching to electricity in transportation, industrial use, heat for commercial buildings, residential buildings. My sense is there hasn't been a lot of discussion yet about what are the policy mechanisms to actually drive that electrification, drive that fuel switching. So maybe you can start with that, just with any ideas you have, and then anybody else on the panel that wants to jump in with their thoughts on that, I'd welcome it.
So policy mechanisms you're talking about for driving this shift to electrification.
Yeah.
Okay, I can work in an answer there. I just want to tell you I'm getting a bit antsy up here because everybody is being so collaborative and nice to each other. I feel like beating someone up. We're fundamentally competitive. Yeah, thanks, Robert. If we hadn't had such a good experience in Alberta, I'd fight back. But look, so I'm going to pick on gas. I think I'm going to pick on gas here. I think part of the electrification, solution here really has to do with recognition of the fact that coal-fired generation is now, on the floor, and you'd feel bad kicking it. Gas is going to be needed for this interim period, for sure, in jurisdictions across the country. But gas is next up on the chopping block. We've got a very few short years, period here of years, as we transition away from gas to renewables plus various forms of storage, not just the type of storage that Jake has talked about, but all of the new types of storage technology coming online, and we're close to getting there. I think electrification is going to have a lot to do with recognizing that gas-fired electricity produces half as much GHG emissions as coal does. I mean, that's still a lot of GHG emissions, and you have to ask yourself, if we're going to just look at the Ontario market, this province is depending on hitting its 2020 GHG reduction targets by introducing the cap-and-trade system. But the 2030 reduction targets are not going to be achievable if we if we try to bridge, the nuclear refurbishments entirely with gas, for example. Because starting in 2020 or 2021 or whatever it is, we're going to have the need for 2 to 3 gigawatts worth of electricity generation, which is going to change that sort of 94 or 96% emission-free profile that you spoke about, John, if we fill it in with gas-fired generation. So I think, sorry to be kind of, operational about this, but an important part of electrifying Canada is going to be tackling gas-fired generation next.
Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize that, we talk about 2020, we talk about 2030, but when you're talking about climate change, of course, you're really talking about 2050 and later. And when we talk about looking at 80% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, the only way you get there, which every academic institution that's looked at this question has concluded, is through significant electrification. It's great if we clean our electricity system. It's even better if we clean our electricity system and use that to reduce emissions in other sectors. How do you get there? Well, part of it is carbon pricing is critical. We need to drive investment decisions that say, make you think hard about investing in some of those carbon-based opportunities. Right now, we're entering in Alberta a discussion about should we be compensating coal-fired generation for shutting it down. So are we going to be in a situation 10 years from now where people who are building gas plants today, we're going to have the same conversation. Do we need to compensate gas plants because we've got to shut them down? Those signals have to be out there so investors can take that into account when they take those risks going forward. I think the other thing we need to start thinking about very seriously is infrastructure. And that's infrastructure both within the electricity system itself. If you're going to move to massively ramp up electricity supply to deal with electrification, you need to start planning for that from a systems perspective and transmission and everything else. You also need to look at infrastructure in other sectors like transportation and how you would support that going forward. And one of the other themes that's emerged this morning is in this discussion of collaboration, we're all sitting here very nicely as different generating technologies and talking about collaboration. We also need governments to collaborate. I will say over and over again that the way Canada functions today, we actually design policies so that we try to optimize 10 different electricity systems, which only means that we have one national electricity system that is suboptimal. And we're not going to have a national electricity system, but we don't look enough at opportunities for collaboration between Alberta, BC, Quebec, Ontario, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, to try and drive efficient outcomes from all of those criteria that we talked about: reliability, cost, affordability, going forward. And the last note I'll just say is that we also have to recognize as people involved in electricity supply that banging the drum and saying we're going to need a lot more electricity has to be accompanied with a message that says, and we have to use that electricity as efficiently as possible.
Okay, so Before we open it up for just a few questions, would like to hear one thing from each of you, and we'll start with you, John. So we've talked about quite a bit of what's happened in the past 12 months that has been a shot in the arm for clean, low-carbon electricity that has started to build this momentum. Looking at your crystal ball, at the next 12 months, what's the one thing? Is there a specific event? Is there something that a decision that a certain government has to take? Is there something happening with your technology that you think is going to be one of the defining and catalyzing moments in 2016 for continuing to build this momentum?
We welcomed the new government with a letter to the Prime Minister suggesting that in the context of the COP21, I might consider, in addition to the clean energy financing ideas, is a Climate Change Innovation Council. And therein lies some of the ideas I just want to mention here. The research and development in our various industries, certainly in the nuclear sector, promise some very interesting ideas that might really help us through the somewhat uncertain period ahead, where we talked about you want to integrate, you're not quite sure how you integrate. How do you change your business models? This is what Lisa Francis said this morning, and I think it's really important. Because in our sector, in the nuclear, everyone knows that it's a very capital-intensive business. And that was a model that may have to be looked at increasingly in the future, because there are smaller jurisdictions, countries, who may look at nuclear power as a very important part of their energy mix, and also part of their education and knowledge base as well, because of the skills required to operate it. We're looking at small modular reactors, sometimes very, very small reactors. These can go from anywhere from 5 megawatts to maybe 300. The technologies are there. There's some new technologies that don't produce any waste. They could be used in remote communities. They could be used on mining sites, and they could be added onto existing nuclear sites. So we get a situation where, okay, you're taking a couple of the big power plants out of commission for refurbishment. You can either extend the life of Pickering, or you could, by then, have a licensed smaller reactor of 300 megawatts that comes in and picks up the power base load at that point. So there's the kind of vision for the future. Highly safe, passively safe, smaller reactors that have a deployment that goes beyond the sort of existing sites and into parts we haven't even thought about, but with the same level of safety, reliability, and accountability.
Jake.
So yeah, we want to think about the next 12 months. I think we also want to think about sort of the next 4 years, or some of the election cycles as they come around. Over the next 12 months for us, I mean, obviously carbon pricing from the federal government and how that's going to work with the different provinces, and that somehow it all being stitched together toward being the net positive that we need it to be, and that is essentially a price on carbon that will drive further investment into renewables, all of us here on stage. So that'll be something that we'll be very keen and very interested in. I think in the U.S. side too, we're going to want to watch how the Clean Power Plan unfurls. It will be in force on December 22nd. So it'll be interesting to see how much effort will be put into fighting it, how much effort will be put into complying with it. And I think there's real opportunity for Canada to be a large-scale solution provider to our friends to the south. I met with Secretary Minitz last year, the Energy Secretary from the United States, and he was talking about how the current administration is committed to an all-of-the-above solution. And I said to him, well, that's great for us Canadians, because we're all of the above.
We are above.
We sit above, and we have every solution possible to help them. So it really depends how serious they really are about climate change. But when they get serious, we'll be ready to help them. So that's something we'll want to watch over the next 12 months and watch unfold. But I say over the next election cycle as well, because I am mindful of the fact that we've sort of had a bit of a miniature revolution happen here. Provincially and federally, and I think we're all kind of still sort of just processing it. It's fairly unique. It's pretty amazing that we've had the change happen in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, at the federal level. But I am mindful of the fact that there are still a lot of Debbie Downers out there. They're waiting for the counter-revolution of the next election cycle. They're waiting to see whether or not clean renewables can step up and provide, and to see whether or not there's an opportunity to go back to doing things the old way, deflating our balloon somewhat. And so we're all going to have to be very focused on communicating our value proposition and making sure that the wins that we attain are well understood by everyone, so that what we are experiencing now becomes the new normal, that we don't accidentally somehow get rewound during the next set of election cycles, because that's always a possibility.
Robert, your crystal ball.
Yeah, I would say we talk about electricity markets, but we can't deny that electricity is a policy-driven industry. And things to look for next year, I would say twofold. One, Alberta and Saskatchewan have set very aggressive targets. Do they successfully take the first steps towards implementation in 2016? The other thing is that in Ontario and Quebec, we're looking at the release of a new Quebec energy strategy and a new long-term energy plan in Ontario. Both of those documents, which will have a lot to say about the future mix of electricity sources going forward. And it will also be very interesting to see how those documents integrate with the aspirations on climate change going forward as well.
I would say that from a solar perspective, the price signals coming out of the large renewable procurement for utility scale solar, which are being delayed, but we'll see them, in the next 2 or 3 months. They're going to fundamentally change people's view about the price of solar. I mean, we may not hit the single digits, but we're going to be very close. I think that's going to be significant. I actually think that the collaboration that wind and solar completed in the Alberta market, which has resulted in a sort of more comprehensive approach to looking at how to bring renewables into an electricity system. I think this is going to be a huge success. I think they're going to move aggressively. We're going to see the details of the program in the sort of April-May timeframe. I think that sort of solution is going to be a signal to the other provinces that are coming online with things like this, and it's going to deliver very low price solar and wind. Similarly, in Saskatchewan, I think the price signals coming out from that Sask Power controlled, very tight procurement are going to deliver on the cost side. So my crystal ball says positive news for us in the next 12 months, resulting from price discovery and from some good work that we've been doing in terms of being more comprehensive and collaborative when we look at a jurisdiction's needs from a renewable energy perspective.
All right, so we do have just a few minutes for some questions. I see we have one. This has been a pretty friendly conversation, so if you want to see an argument between these gentlemen up here, then this would be your chance to spark that with a provocative question. So we'll go to mic number 2 with the first question.
It's not a provocative question. My name is Marwan Ghalib. I'm from the Ottawa Renewable Energy Cooperative. And we've spoken a lot about 2020, 2030. While that's extremely important, I believe we should also accompany that with speaking about 2015 and 2016. Along with what Robert said, while we push for more consumption, we should push as well for more using our energy efficiently and conserving energy as well. Are there any efforts being put into that to make the public aware about how important it is to conserve the energy? And I've heard this somewhere before, I'm not sure how accurate it is, that it is more economically efficient to conserve energy than to push for more conserve energy than to push for more generation. So if you have any comments about that, or if you know of any efforts being put into public awareness about this. Thank you so much.
I see John chomping at the bit here. So John.
I know, I'm feeling increasingly feisty up here, like I was saying. Look, conservation, demand management, extremely important thing. Notionally in my mind, I realize that, I understand it. Here at CanSIA, our job is to promote solar energy, not at the expense of conservation. But I think what is interesting is, when does distributed generation like solar, when you bring it down to a homeowner's level, where they've got panels on their roof and a storage battery in their basement, like I'm about to get, when they've got a smart meter on every single home and business, an electric vehicle in their driveway, when does that become a form of conservation or demand management, really? Because you're taking the need for electricity away. And as we go into this net metering future, I think we are beginning to see aspects of solar that really do translate into conservation and demand management.
Robert.
I'll just say, just to build again on the keynote speaker, I made the statement about it's a policy-driven industry, which is true, but it's also a regulated industry. And one of the challenges we have, whether it's in efficiency or whether it's storage, is that we have all of these new potential contributors to the electricity supply-demand mix, and we don't really have electricity markets yet that have fully grasped how to actually reward, incent, encourage these things. And that's a big challenge that I think we all need to partake in terms of thinking through that reform, because efficiency is also a huge untapped resource, and it is the cheapest thing to do.
Conservation, my members throughout the country, the different utilities, are noted leaders in some of these communication efforts that you refer to, and incentivization programs, etc. One of the things too is that for a lot of the projects that are promoted for hydropower, like I say, we are unique in Canada. We are still promoting some sizable hydropower projects compared to other countries around the world. One of the things is that you have to justify these things to the shareholders, who in many cases are the people of the province. And these are done through some pretty robust utility hearings and forums. And the first question that's always asked is, have we done enough on conservation and efficiency to justify this next big source of generation? And I think that's fairly strongly rooted throughout Canada, but there's a lot more that can be done. And I think that questions of conservation are always important, but efficiency is also important. One of the things you can talk about, just about electrifying vehicles, for example, one of the interesting things about adopting that technology as it comes on is that many of them, by their very nature, would charge overnight. And they would actually be drawing on resources that are already in place, but that are not generating at that time. So creating actually displacing some need for energy during off-peak time and using what we already have in place for greater efficiency, being stored in an electric vehicle battery. These are the kinds of things that are also very exciting. And I think, as you suggest in your question, is you don't have to build new generation. You don't have to build new transmission for that sort of thing. You can actually better use what you already have. And I think we're all very interested in that sort of thing for sure.
All right. So that brings this panel to a close. I'd like to thank all of the panelists for their thoughts this morning, sharing them with us. Coming up next is a networking break on the trade show floor, which was generously sponsored by Panasonic. So again, thanks to all of the panelists, thanks to all of you, and I'm sure any of these gentlemen would gladly take your more provocative questions on the sidelines over the course of the day. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dan. That's good.